The Legend of Zelda timeline is controversial, to say the least. On paper, the concept of connecting these games works really well. The series is practically absolute snack and interesting lore, and there are several examples of overarching story threads and character arcs spread across multiple games, as well as certain themes that are present across the entire series. The problem, however, comes in with the execution. In 2011, Nintendo released My Namesake with the intention of creating a definitive timeline, and while certain parts of it made good use of the elements mentioned earlier, it was painfully obvious which games had been made without a larger story in mind, thus leading to the birth of the Downfall timeline, a metaphorical rug for Nintendo to sweep all the games they didn't know what to do with under. Aside from it just being a cop-out, the way this was handled really rubs me the wrong way for one specific reason. This takes the original Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening, three of the most important and influential games for both the series and industry as a whole, and just throws them into a what-if scenario. Maybe it's just me, but they deserve so much better than that. Luckily though, there is a silver lining here, and it comes in the form of a quote directly from the Hyrule Historia, on the page right before the timeline is revealed. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within this tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Hyrule's history is a continuously woven tapestry of events. Changes that seem inconsequential, disregarded without even a shrug, could evolve at some point to hatch new legends and, perhaps, change the tapestry of history itself. To summarize, this is Nintendo openly stating that the timeline is not set in stone and could possibly be altered by anyone. They even seemingly doubled down on this when they switched the positioning of Link's Awakening in the Oracle games. Personally, I couldn't be happier that the paragraph exists, because I've got a few tweaks to make, and it seems like I've got permission to make them, indirectly at least. The first thing we need to figure out is how another timeline split came to be in the first place, and luckily, we don't need to look that hard. In this climax of Skyward Sword, Link travels back in time, fights Demise, the original Demon King. He defeats him, gets cursed, saves Zelda, and goes back to his time. But hold on. If Demise is dead in the past, then the events of Skyward Sword couldn't have happened, at least in the same way they originally did, as he was Girahim's main motivation for putting those events into motion. Despite this, however, the state of the world in the present seems to imply that everything happened in the same way. Now, before I go any further, there are some things I should address. I know there are a few things in this game that contradict the conclusion I was about to arrive at. Truth be told, the mechanics of the Gate of Time are pretty convoluted and could be the topic of their own video, quite frankly. But going off examples of time travel across the rest of the series, as well as some good old-fashioned logic, I think assuming that a split formed here makes a lot of sense, especially once we see how many other puzzle pieces begin to fall into place when we run with that train of thought. This next bit's going to sound a little out there at first, but stay with me because I have good reasons. What I want to do is take Minish Cap and both Four Swords games, which I will refer to as the Four Swords trilogy from now on, and place them at the beginning of this new timeline. Again, running with the assumption that Skyward Sword created a split, there are three major loose ends to cover. Those loose ends are the past version of Girahim still being alive, the Goddess Sword coexisting with the Sleeping Master Sword, and the Triforce pieces being hidden in Sky Keep. I believe that all of these are tied up in the backstory of Minish Cap, with an uprising of monsters being defeated by a hero who wielded a legendary blade, which would later be forged into a more powerful one using elemental magic, and a powerful artifact in the form of a golden triangle. It's definitely reasonable to say if Girahim was still around and had no way of resurrecting Demise, then he would take up the mantle and lead the armies into battle. Also, while it's far from a one-to-one, the Picori Blade and Goddess Sword do look somewhat similar. Here's the real kicker though. When the Minish gifted the old hero these artifacts, it said that they descended from the sky. There isn't really much to talk about in the original Four Swords game, but Four Swords Adventures is where the theory really gets interesting. In the original version of the timeline, Four Swords Adventures took place after Twilight Princess, and was the only instance in the entire series where Ganon was reincarnated. Not resurrected or breaking through some seal, but full-on reborn as a new person, the same way Link is, with the game's backstory focusing on the origins of the new Ganondorf. If we place this game in the new timeline, disconnected from the Ocarina of Time continuity, this random inconsistency starts to make a little more sense. This isn't a new version of Ganondorf, but rather an alternate one. To backtrack a little bit, Demise's Curse and Skyward Sword was put on the future versions of Link and Zelda, and considering that neither of them actually existed in the time period the curse was placed, it could be concluded that this curse doesn't apply to the new split of the timeline. This would actually explain a pretty big difference between the two versions of Ganondorf. In Ocarina of Time, he was born with the hunger for power and naturally drawn to conflict and war because of Demise's curse. But in Four Swords Adventures, he was actually seduced by the Dark Trident, simply because of his own character. Under this theory, the Downfall timeline tells a story of a version of Link and Ganon never affected by Demise's curse. That stuff's all well and good, but we still have yet to connect the Four Swords trilogy to the original Downfall timeline continuity, so let's fix that. The first massive piece of evidence comes in the Game Boy Advance port of Link to the Past, which came packaged with the original Four Swords game. In the game, there's an optional dungeon called the Palace of the Four Sword, an obvious connection to the titular weapon from the aforementioned game. I also feel the need to point out the title screen of Link to the Past. I understand if you didn't buy the small similarities to the Goddess Sword, but come on, this is just the Bakori blade. Is it definitive evidence for the theory? No, but it is still a very interesting coincidence. The next thing I want to look at is Ganon's design in all these games. Obviously in Four Swords Adventures, he looks the same as the rest of the Downfall timeline, but what I also want to draw attention to is his weapon of choice, the Trident. With the exception of spin-offs like Hyrule Warriors, this piece of equipment only appears in the Downfall timeline and, you guessed it, Four Swords Adventures. In fact, not only does he have the weapon in both games, but Four Swords even provides a backstory for how he obtained it. For the final piece of evidence, I want to return to backstories. Link to the Past, specifically. In a short cutscene before the game, we hear about a massive takeover of Hyrule, known as the Sealing War, which of course, was led by Ganon. This eventually ended with him being sealed by 7 wise men. Now, this sounds very similar to the actual story of Four Swords Adventures. Now, to be completely fair, in the actual game, he is sealed by the 7 maidens and not the wise men, but as a counterpoint, the maidens in this game look practically identical to the ones in Link to the Past, who are canonically descendants of the individuals from the Sealing War. So, it's my theory that Four Swords Adventures is a prequel to Link to the Past and tells the story of the Sealing War. There isn't much left to talk about. Most of the games in the timeline are direct continuations of Link to the Past. The only thing that I really have a problem with is the placement of the first 2 Zelda games, which really don't fit in where they are currently, but that's a theory for another day. So for the time being, that's where I'm going to wrap it up. I'm the Hyrule Historian, thank you for watching, and I'm going to go touch grass. See ya!